Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo.
That really is true. I mean, the outlook of many people is, well, okay, let's have a period of reform. We'll reform for 5 years or 10 years at most or something, and then let's get on with it. But this other notion that we're talking about here is much broader than that. That is, we're trying to say that by its very nature, the church must always be adapting.
Today on Reflections, Father Bacik talks with Father James Cryan, pastor of St. Pius X Church in Toledo, Ohio. Father Bacik and Father Cryan will discuss Hans Küng, church reform as a continuing task. And now, here is Father Bacik.
Jim, you and I have lived through a great reforming time in the history of the church. We did our seminary studies under an older classical approach to theology. We knew the old ways in the church, and then we were ordained priests, and then it came time to be involved in the renewal. I mean, almost as soon as we were ordained, it was time to start putting into practice the changes that came out in the Second Vatican Council. And so we've lived through reform. I can remember the early days when I was an associate pastor and preaching about the liturgical changes when they came in and being so excited about it and saying, you know, this was such a tremendous thing. And I was always positive about that. I always thought this will be good for our parish and it will help us to renew ourselves. And all along, it seems like ever since we've been trying to catch up with the Second Vatican Council and put it into practice and get more and more people to understand what it was about. In a way, our pastoral ministries have been reforming ministries, I suppose. We've been involved in trying to see how the church could be renewed in so many ways.
I think part of what's happened is the fact that we don't consider renewal having a specific terminus. That produces a lot of anxiety in the church, but we've become used to the fact that we always keep talking about the reforms, and these reforms are 25 years old practically. So I think that the church has adjusted to the fact that it is an ongoing renewal always, and I think it's part of the mindset of the church right now. What is happening culturally? Nothing happens economically, politically, sociologically, anywhere in the world that the church says, what is this saying about us, about our response, what it has been, where this is leading us, and what's the church going to do now?
That's true. You know, the church really, at the most official levels, is doing that. I happen to be going to a conference in the not-too-distant future talking about how the new religions are making an impact on campus life and the church's response to that. And this is initiated at the highest official levels, as I understand it, if I understand the conference properly. But I've seen many examples of that where the leadership knows that it has to be in touch with the changing times if it's going to minister effectively. In fact, in our Second Vatican Council, we have that statement that the great rule of preaching the gospel is adaptation to the culture and the changing times in which we live.
It's difficult for a lot of people, even I think for the Pope himself, at the present Pope especially, to observe, like, for instance, what culture means to a people. How does one incorporate that as a response to the mission of the church to anywhere in the world? And we find strange things happening. For instance, the thing that Küng points out about communion not in the hand here in the United States when everyone does it, and why the African liturgy couldn't be done in some kind of Africanese culture. There's difficulties in this, but the overwhelming effect is there's not one level of the church that's not touched by this. Many people say that shows a weakness in the church. Given the days of Woodrow Wilson and Leo XIII in Rome, we'd have a perfect world to work in, and that isn't the way of the world anymore. It's not just a phenomenon of the church, and I really feel that, my own personal bias, is that's a sign of health.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that, and I think that's the stance we've taken on reform all the way along the line, in concert with many of the official leaders. That is, that reform's a good thing, that it's healthy, that the church needs it, and we even have that statement in the Second Vatican Council that the church must always be reforming itself. really key notion. I want to go back, though, Jim, to a point you made before about the fact that there doesn't seem to be any end to it is very disturbing to people. That really is true. I mean, the outlook of many people is, well, okay, let's have a period of reform. We'll reform for 5 years or 10 years at most or something, and then let's get on with it. But this other notion that we're talking about here is much broader than that. That is, we're trying to say that by its very nature, the church must always be adapting, must always be reforming itself. One, because it will always pick up those barnacles that Pope John the 23rd talked about. It will always be in danger of stagnating in some ways, or coming up with traditions that don't really accord with the gospel. On the other hand, the church must always be renewing itself because of the changes in culture, as I think you so well pointed out. As the culture changes, the church has to always figure out what does the gospel mean in this situation. How are we going to proclaim the gospel of this culture with this new historical setting?
Formerly, it was easy, for instance, for, say, even in preaching, say, here's the problem, here's the answer, now shape up. And all you had to do is give them a little bombing run over the pews. You bomb them with guilt, and they pull themselves up off the floor and dust the rubble off of them. You hit them with authority this time. And I think people found security in that. At the same time, the very issues that the church says we must address, not only in-house issues, such as liturgy and the length of women's dresses in the church and stuff like that, and the audibility of certain words in the canon of the Mass, but the very issues about justice, economy, all those things are vastly complex that even the leadership doesn't have a complete handle on. And rather than say to the people, well, this could be a problem here, but we really don't know what that is over there, either people get very tongue-tied or else they simply say, we'll find our sources elsewhere.
Well, that is a certain type of problem in our church, but we also have to recognize there are some people who also feel liberated by the reform and feel exhilarated by it and are happy that the church is reforming itself and want the process to keep going forward and say, we haven't gone far enough in that yet. We have to keep up this whole business of adapting the gospel and reading the signs of the times and trying to deal with the complex changing world. Jim, let's take a look a little bit here at one of the leaders of the Reform in the 20th century Catholic Church, Hans Küng, a Swiss priest, a diocesan priest, who was educated in Rome and went to the Gregorian University there, and sort of, I think, lived himself in the old line church. That was back in 1948. Well, it would have had to have been. I mean, his seminary training was under the old classical form, and I think he took to it pretty much and bought into it, accepted a great deal of that whole approach. He was very influenced, I think, as he said himself at that time, by the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius, another very traditional form of prayer. But he was ordained then a priest in 1954 in Rome, just to locate him a little bit. But later on, he went and studied in France and became acquainted with what was called at that time the New Theology in the 50s. And Yves Congar, great Dominican scholar, theologian, especially an expert on the church, began to be an influence on him. And it was from Congar that Küng picked up that important phrase, the church must always be reforming itself, as a sort of abiding task of the church, not a once-for-all event, but something the church had to be doing all the time, and began to popularize that. In fact, he wrote a famous book called The Council, Reform, and Reunion, that was published around the time of the beginning of the council in 1962. I forget the exact date when that book was published, but it was around I think it actually was published before the council, and Küng himself, and I think this is important to recognize, had an agenda. He always has thought of himself as being, I think, an important figure in the world of theology, or having a mission. Part of his mission was to reform the church, and he wrote the book, I think, to help set the agenda for the Second Vatican Council. And he did a lot of lecturing in Rome. He became an expert at the council. He wasn't during the first session, and near the end, I think he quit that post because he had trouble with Cardinal Ottaviani. But in between, he did go around giving lectures to bishops and writing articles and so on, with a very clear, explicit purpose to influence the direction of the reform in the church. Well, so our friend Hans Küng here, we could say a whole lot more about him. He's probably the best known of contemporary theologians, I would say, because he's been in Time magazine and made 5 major lecture tours of the United States and has been very controversial, and many people know him, unfortunately, because he ended up being condemned or sort of restricted in his activities in 1979 by the Sacred Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, as they deprived him of his right to teach in Catholic seminaries or to do the examining for Catholic seminarians, although he continues to be a part of the Ecumenical Institute at Tübingen University. So he's become known, I suppose, because of the controversial side of his writings and so on, and often calling for reform and people thinking that maybe he's gone too far in all of this. Jim, you want to comment anything at all about that?
I think make it clear for the radio audience that the reform in the church is not nitpicking for him. It is really, I think, an advantage for him to try to come up with models that people like graphic things. This is a model for the church. I remember as a kid, someone would say, "What if the church is the courthouse? Now, what are you looking for? You're looking for, the lawgiver, the sheriff, and all that sort of thing. But what would it be like if the church were a ship? Well, you didn't want a captain. What's your relationship with the captain?" As puerile as those examples were, people do like graphic models, and Kung, in trying to express himself, looks for better models for the church, even on the office of the Pope.
Yes.
Is it the chief of the corporation, the head of the corporation, or is it the pastoral associate who moves among facilitating the discussion at the table, that sort of thing? And however one perceives those models, you end up with two very clear thrusts in the church.
That is very true, and I think it's not just sort of the average person in the pew that likes models, but theologians like models as well because they help focus our attention and direct our thinking. Avery Dulles wrote a famous book about the church called The Models of the Church, in which he described 5 different models. Talks about the church as an institution, or as a sacrament of the risen Lord, or as a servant community, or as a community of followers of Jesus. And one of those models, interestingly enough, was the church as a herald. And Dulles talked about that as a very Protestant model of the church. That what the church was a group of people that proclaimed the good news, that spoke out the gospel, that preached the word. And he does link in his own thinking Hans Kung with that model, that very Protestant model of the church. Now, this has been common in thinking about how Kung understands reform in the church because he was very influenced by the Protestant world. And he did that through his doctoral dissertation, which was on the famous Protestant theologian Karl Barth, who died in 1968. And Kung knew him. In fact, at his funeral, Kung was the only Catholic there and giving one of the eulogies for Karl Barth. And he called him sort of a father at that time of both Protestant and Catholic theology. So, and Barth invited Kung to come and lecture at the University of Basel, where he himself lectured. That was one of Kung's first major lectures. After he was ordained, he functioned as a parish priest for a while, and then gradually moved into this world of being an academic theologian. So Kung is a very Protestant kind of thinker that way. At least he shares that herald model, that the church is the herald or the announcer, the prophetic voice in relationship to the kingdom of God.
Which is freedom in a certain sense to do his own investigations. For many people today, the theology of Luther is academic. It's part of past church history. But if the church is to proclaim Jesus Christ, then maybe everybody has something worthwhile listening to, and no matter what schisms have been created in the church, perhaps if we go back and understand what the real issues here were, we'd have that kind of unanimity of spirit that the church is trying to proclaim to a fractured world. So that kind of that theological bent on his part gave him that freedom, I believe, to do a lot of studies on Karl Barth or Martin Luther. Sure.
Yeah, and I think some of us have heard him lecture on Martin Luther, and very powerful statements, and a very positive reading of Luther. So we know there's a time in the history of Catholic thought where Luther was sort of the bad person, and very harsh things said about Luther, and not much honest engagement with his thought. it was more concentrated on his moral life and said, well, because of these moral problems that he wasn't worth listening to. But Kung bypassed all of that and tried to see Luther as a prophetic figure, as one who really understood the abuses in the church and had important things to say about reform, things that the Second Vatican Council finally caught up with, the whole importance of the laity in the church, for example, the importance of the vernacular, going back to the Scriptures as the real judge upon the life of the church. Many of these things that we in the Catholic community have now come to accept were proposed by Martin Luther back in the 16th century. So Kung's rereading of Luther, while not uncritical, I must say, accepted a whole lot of those things. I think he was very critical of Luther's attitude towards the Jewish community, for example. And so that there was a lot of things that, Kung had to criticize about Luther, but the positive thrust of reform in the church, he did go along with.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Hans Kung, you mentioned the models, Jim, one of those being the herald model. Maybe we should explore a little bit more what that might mean. One of the things that it clearly suggests is that there is a sharp distinction between the church and the kingdom. A church is not the kingdom in Kung's thought. In fact, when you have all these parables in the Gospels about the kingdom of God is like the mustard seed, and all these many parables of Jesus, well, there was a way in which Catholic preachers often equated those parables with the church. So they would say not the mustard seed isn't like the kingdom, but like the church, which will grow and grow and become large and powerful. And Kung really undercuts that idea, and I think properly so, and in agreement with much of contemporary scholarship, that Jesus wasn't talking about the church, but about the kingdom. That is the reign of God. Wherever there's peace and justice and righteousness existing, there is the kingdom. The kingdom will finally triumph. The church is a herald of that, proclaimer of that whole business of the workings out of the kingdom.
I like the model because in the Eucharistic, at the communion of the Mass, as you pray for the coming of the kingdom, immediately it's followed by deliver us from anxiety. In other words, we who stand there, once you live in the expectation that the kingdom is yet to come, at the grace of God, you still get that sense of not just passively waiting for it, but the passion to see it come about. And once you get that passion to see the kingdom come about, then you really do need to be delivered from anxiety, because you say, what do we do now? How do we be saved? That sort of thing. And I just like the idea, if one anticipates the kingdom, one will start working towards it.
That's a most important insight, I think, and really is part of Kung's passion. In other words, although the church is a sinful church for him, and the church must always be reformed, it has an important function, and you can't just let it go and say, well, it's not the kingdom, forget it. It's a sinful group. We'll just be passive about it and say, yeah, we got a lot of crummy people, and let's leave it go at that. Kung's reaction was exactly the opposite. He became passionate for reform. If it's going to be a good herald, then it has to be faithful to the gospel. If it's going to do a good job of proclaiming the kingdom, then it really must be listening to the voice of Jesus Christ. And so this seems to have fueled his passion, as a matter of fact, where many people could say, well, you would just get paralyzed with that model or sit back and say it's not terribly important. So the herald model, I think, is a good one. We don't hear about that one too much. You ever notice if you hear popular lectures on the church and so on, there's a lot on the church as the sacrament and the church as the community and so on, a lot of railing against the church as an institution. You don't hear much about the herald model.
No, but one of the benefits of the what people have referred to as the clergy crisis, so forth, I think people are recognizing that really the basic contact with the gospel will be through them. You cannot simply be a place where it's heard from a pulpit that if anyone is to meet Jesus Christ, they'll meet it through other Christians. That's the only way it's going to happen. And therefore, not in a preachy sense of banging them with the Bible, but really saying how I live out my commitment to everyday life is a critical issue of my fidelity to the Word of Jesus Christ. In any of the parables, any of the Sermon on the Mount, that becomes a criterion on whether or not I have salvation.
Yeah, so it makes the question of reform very personal in that sense, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The community and us as individual members of it have to be involved in this conversion process, working towards reform.
But I think another herald model that's come out of this is the fact, you find it everywhere, the model of, not of hierarchies, but of ministering servants, people ministering to each other. Any parish you go into is a massive network of different kinds of ministry. Everybody gets into it, and they get together to seem to rejoice. I've got this mission in life. You should hear about this person I've met. And from that, they are, I believe, just identifying themselves as a ministering community. Ministering is a different model, but I think they believe they are projecting something. There's a witness there.
Yeah, I think that's true. We often talk about that as peer ministry these days, people reaching out to others who are like themselves. And I think it's important to realize that Kung, in talking about this reform, is not a revolutionary. You know, he doesn't want to unleash all sorts of movements in the church that are just going to run roughshod over the tradition. He's not interested in overthrowing the tradition. Reform really is the word that captures, I think, what he wants. It's a renewal. It's getting back to the roots of it. He loved Pope John the 23rd. He remains one of his great heroes. And he likes that aggiornamento idea. We're going to throw open the windows and have a breath of fresh air, but it's always going to be faithful to the tradition and responding to the insights of Jesus Christ.
Yeah, he's not an iconoclast. He very seldom gets very aggressive about a practice in the church that has to go or a defect. He describes it as the basilica that does not need to be torn down, but just repainting it isn't enough either. It has to make room for other people to get into the house, and or it has to adjust itself to the needs of those who are in the house. And that is a model, I think, that even homemakers can identify. You don't necessarily move from one house to the other. We do more in spring cleanup. You say, is for the people we have here, what's the best way of accommodating them? So
that's a much more personalistic approach. That's very good, Jim. So it's not a matter of tearing down the church, nor is it a matter just of repainting it, but it is populating it in a new way and setting up the relationships within it in a new and better way, right? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
I like that.
Yeah, and I think because it does require a little bit of thought on that, he's been the subject of a lot of attack. People they hear his name and they bristle, aha, troublemaker. But he's not at all. He's simply asked, make the home accommodating for what our purposes are. And of course, with you mentioned, though, as founded by Jesus Christ, he has a little bit of difficulty talking about direct foundation of the church, which is a scriptural problem there. But I think he really calls on if everyone is faithful, it's not a monolith.
Yeah, and that's the real key, is fidelity to Jesus Christ. Right. Yeah, your point is well taken, Jim. But I don't know how I exactly phrased that, but Kung does have a lot of problem with the question of Jesus founding a church. And he certainly is in the camp of those who see a very indirect relationship that way. He certainly doesn't want to say that Jesus sat down one day and drew out a flow chart with popes and bishops and cardinals and so on. That it is a much more indirect process, the way we ended up with the church. So Hans Kung, a really fascinating kind of figure, the way he has sort of cut through the consciousness of people. He's been sort of the key figure in the reform. People have kept looking to him to see, what's he have to say about all of this. He's been a spokesperson, I suppose you would say, for much of the longing of the liberal wing within the church. Liberals have always found him to be out front and in the avant-garde and saying things that they are just vaguely feeling, or having the courage to say things out loud that maybe they're afraid to say. So he has been a prophetic figure in that way, for sure, in much of the church reform. Jim, he talks as well about other models of the church that helps us to see things. I think in his book, famous book, The Church, he did talk about the church as the happening of the Spirit, or the event.
I just hit it, the creation of the Spirit.
You're right. That's exactly what it is. The church as the creation of the Spirit. Yeah. Very good.
Which is a model, certainly found from Genesis all the way through Pentecost, as the hovering Spirit bringing forth creation. I like it because it seems to me, again, an organic model. It's just like the power of the sun drawing life from the soil right now at springtime, and life looks beautiful, and he can get exhilarated from that. So he sees the Spirit moving across the history, the sociological history of the human race, and creating Spirit community out of this. The concrete people with a very definite mission to herald the final, sunlight. But it's a model that the creation of the Spirit that allows people to say, that Spirit within, I am part of the process. I'm in there, which is also this thing about the church. The laity are not the receptacles of holy things and holy messages. Rather, they have a proclaiming mission also.
That's why Hans Kung loved the Corinthian letters of Paul and the church in Corinth. For him, that was sort of the primary way the church was lived out. And he makes